Russell Orhi, aka Russwole, is one of the strongest powerlifters currently moving weight. Ranked on open powerlifting by his dots, it places him at number 38 all time in the raw category, with a best comp squat of 340 kilos in the 90 kilo class. Remember, John Hack's best is 345 kilos in the same class, and an all-time best squat of 347 kilos. Russell has firmly earned himself a place in this series. Russell's squat is what I would describe as a great example of a competition squat. The goal of the competition squat is to reach depth with the most amount of weight possible, and preferably in a relatively safe fashion. This isn't the style of squat we would use with a weightlifter or a jiu-jitsu athlete. In these cases, we're looking for something essentially the opposite. We want to use the most weight possible with the greatest range of motion while staying within the athlete's limits. For example, if we take the weightlifter squat, let's say Laura Dana Toma from Romania, if we look at her squat, we'll see a high bar position with as much forward knee travel as her leverages and ankle range of motion will allow. We want to do this to maximize the lifter's capacity in the bottom position of the squat to transfer to the clean, or if we take the jiu-jitsu athlete, the bottom of a sweep for example. When we look at Russell's squat, it's maximizing all his positions from the foot position to the bar position to ensure he can reach depth in the strongest position possible. So let's start with the top of the squat first. The old rule of thumb for the low bar squat used to be get the barbell as low as possible before it got to the crease of the shoulder. This point of the armpit was always the hard line for the absolute limit of depth, both in practicality and in the written rules of powerlifting. The whole idea when bringing the barbell lower is to bring the bar closer to the hips and shortening the length of the liver, thus limiting the amount of force the weight can act upon the lifter. Lower isn't always better though. Our shoulders cannot support the weight as the bar goes much lower than the armpit, so there comes a ratio of shoulder strength to bar positioning. As the barbell gets lower, the shoulder position weakens, but what we see in Russell's squat is the perfect ratio of arm position to bar depth. This is a difficult relationship to find, as each lifter will have different arm lengths, different ratios of upper to lower arms, and different ratios between the torso length and arm length. When Russell puts the bar on his back, the arms stay tucked into his sides, which allows him to develop a lot of tension in his arms, shoulders and upper back, and weld the barbell to his back. If you're a powerlifter trying to find this ideal ratio, look at Russ and see how low the barbell sits, then see how tight the gap is between his tricep and his torso. His grip is pretty narrow for a big dude, and this ensures that tension remains throughout the entire squat. The final aspect of this is a vital key. He keeps his wrists stacked and straight. Even if you position your barbell, your shoulders and your arms perfectly and work hard to remain tight, you can still ruin this by allowing your wrist to kick back and allowing all of that tension to bleed out from this position. Coupled with this, Russell looks comfortable in this position, which isn't always the case with the low bar. We'll often see lifters accumulating joints or muscle pain in the wrists, elbows, shoulders or biceps over the course of a training block when using the low bar squat intensely. This will even happen if you use the approach we like here at Seekistan, which is to begin a block dominated by high bar squats and then titrate in the low bar squat sometime around the halfway point. If you're wondering if low bar is always the right option for maximizing your competition squat, for example, you might look at one of the best to do it, John Hack, and think, should I switch to a more high bar squat? Well, the purpose of this series is to watch and find yourself somewhere in here, try the different aspects and see if they work. We will say one thing though, you might be that 1 in 1,000 John Hack, but we have yet to encounter that in our competitive powerlifters. Achieving the highest comp is generally best done with the low bar squat. Let's move to the opposite end of the spectrum, Russell's foot position. Like the low bar position, Russell's foot position is all about maximizing his ability to reach depth with the heaviest weight. Generally, for a high bar squat and even some low bar squats, the base recommendation is approximately hip width. This allows us to find the balance between using our knee and hip extensors without overly exposing any joints to extreme ranges of motion or tension. For example, if we go too wide, the knee joints tend to rotate inwards towards the opposite knee, which increases the risk of knee valgus. This knee valgus pushes the hips back, risking a forward lean of the torso. Russell's foot position is distinctly outside the hip width, which allows him to reach depth without having excessive levels of forward knee travel. This wider stance allows our hips room to sit below parallel without traveling as far from the start of the squat to the bottom. Russell smoothly fights the inherent issues with the overly wide squat stance by keeping his knees tracking over his toes while still using the quads to a great degree. We can see a forward movement of the shin angle, but also a slight degree of external rotation of the hips because the knees move laterally from their start position to track the direction of the toes. So he is both driving his knees forward to use his knee extensors and, consciously or not, pushing his knees out slightly to match the direction of his toes. When trying this in your own training, you'll likely need a period of adaptation if you feel this width suits you. For example, the abductor strength needed is high alongside the requirements on our hip mobility. It's not enough to be mobile in this position, which requires a large degree of hip external rotation. You also require the strength to maintain this position at maximal weights. Otherwise, it is of no use. Some lifters may not have the room in their hip socket for this style of squat, but for those who do, start with mobility exercises like the Russian baby maker. Progressively aim to reach a wider stance as you warm up. Couple this with the pigeon stretch, either seated or standing, and you'll expose your hips to the required range of motion. For abductor strength, the use of a hip circle here is one of the most effective ways of training the necessary strength to maintain the hips open position. Quarter squats with a pause at parallel, crab walks and monster walks are all great tools alongside some hip clamps. It's also sometimes effective to use the hip circle while squatting, but generally only as a minor variation. It's best to try keep the low bar squat unaided by the band and ensure the technique remains consistent. The use of the hip circle while squatting can overemphasize the knees out position and reduce the forward knee drive. I hope you enjoyed today's video. They're great to make, and we hope you get some valuable information from them. Let us know who you want to see next. Today's video is brought to you by the Seek a Strength Road to Anywhere squat program. It can be slotted into anyone's training, if it's weightlifter or powerlifter or an athlete training for their sport. It is 8 weeks in length, 2 sessions per week. It is a tough program, but it will get you those PBs within those 8-week time frame.